Peña from Negros Oriental State University, Dumaguete City, Philippines. I'm going to present my research entitled Extent Involvement of School Managers to Gender Responsive Basic Education Policy in the Philippines. For my content, we have introduction, literature review, methodology, results and discussion, and conclusion. Everyone strives for respect and equality as basic needs in society. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights stipulates that all human beings are born free and are equal in dignity and rights. It further declares the universality of human rights that is to be enjoyed by all people, whoever they are or wherever they live. Despite this universal declaration, the global lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender sector continuously strives to get an equal footing regarding the rights above with the other members of the society. The LGBT communities are eaten up in every street and everywhere, voicing their sentiments of the unrelenting disrespect and inequalities they have been experiencing in school, workplaces, or even in the community where they live. The kind of respect and equality longed for is far from the reality as the sector of society has been facing challenging and hostile situations every day. Unsurprisingly, authorities from countries within the range of influence by the United Nations have not been pushing much on this declaration or issue. Moreover, the LGBT communities just experience minimal effort to address or lessen their anxieties. This apparent indifference is because UN member countries hold homosexuality immoral if not legal. At the forefront of education, UNESCO has joined the list of UN agencies advocating for gender issues to address concerns of the LGBT communities relative to bullying, inequalities, and disrespect. The report, out in the open, written by News and published online at UNESCO News, informs that students who do not confirm their sexuality are the minority group and they become vulnerable in educational settings. More so, the junior high school students who conform to how society expects them to behave or follow their gender preference. In the Philippines, the approval of Gender and Development Law ushered the Adopted Order Number 32 Series of 2017 known as Gender Responsive Basic Education Policy. This policy provides opportunities for LGBT students to enjoy security and safety against violence and discrimination. Under this policy, principals, teachers, and God-focal persons in basic education are to integrate respect for the rights of LGBT students. Existing literature suggests that despite international policies covering LGBT rights and protection in one's sexual orientation, key institutions such as the Australian educational system still implement local policies. Among the 8 states in Australia, only 2 states have duly implemented the policy in protecting the LGBT sector. Apparently, believed that a school with a robust policy could protect all the students, but schools should have clear guidance on protecting LGBT students. Mayer argued that states' lawmaking body indirectly protects the LGBT sector, but the absence of clear protection allows contradicting interpretation and application of the policy at the national level. Thus, this study explored the extent of involvement among school managers of the gender-responsive basic education policy in selected junior high schools in a province in the central Philippines. It aimed to determine if principals, God-focal persons, and teachers can account for the extent implementation of gender-responsive basic education policy in both selected private and public schools in central Philippines. The result of the study will provide a basis for a proposed gender-responsive basic education framework that aims to institutionalize the policy implementation given the kind of environmental conditions the respondent schools are presently experiencing. School, for my literature review, a school with a robust policy can protect all the students, but schools should have a clear guidance on protecting LGBT students. Mayer argued that the state lawmaking body indirectly protects the LGBT sector, but the absence of clear protection allows contradicting interpretation and application of the policy at the national level. Snyder and Demeter revealed having policies is accompanied by this feeling of security and ease to those who are apparent as LGBT in school. Furthermore, the study of Kusu revealed that when the school has a policy on LGBT rights, it enhances the LGBT students' self-esteem, provides safety concerning sexual orientation and gender identity or gender expression, and may establish a positive and harmonious relationship. In educational institutions, LGBT people become subject to discrimination, bullying, and abuse under the guise of academic freedom. Consequently, schools have the right to create their policies. On the contrary, it has been known common knowledge that the curricula do not include LGBT issues. With the school's freedom to institutionalize policies, the LGBT sector became deprived of certain rights enjoyed by other students. For instance, academic institutions formulate policies against cross-dressing and reserve the right not to accept or even expel students that violate these policies. The 1987 Philippine Constitution guarantees the person's right to equal protection of the laws without differentiation. However, the laws protecting human rights are not being equally applied, especially to persons with diverse. Further, the Philippines does not have a comprehensive anti-discrimination law to date, despite an existing state policy to value human dignity and guarantee full respect for human rights. There is no code of ethics or legitimate guidelines to protect LGBT rights in the Philippines. Many are hopeful that more than a decade-old anti-discrimination bill will reach a milestone in its current champion Geraldine Roman, the first trans woman member of the Philippine Congress. Without the formal protection of the non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies that explicitly mention sexual orientation and gender identity, LGBT students may justifiably do so continue to fear discrimination, including harassment. However, Morbis Gurn informed that Ging Cristobal, a Manila-based activist with the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, claimed that although there is a high tolerance here, there is no real acceptance. Moreover, legal recognition and protection of LGBT people at the national level largely remain absent. Goodhan's study on teachers' perception of heteronormativity in elementary schools, the hidden and evaded curricula of gender diversity confirm the need for strategic practices that confront and interrupt homophobia through federal policies, building social capital, inclusive curricula, professional development, and a call for social justice leaders within the schools. Since children experience homophobic violence, oppression, and discrimination as early as elementary, these recommendations are important. Lipkin informed that LGBT youths thrive in their school environments and their accomplishments are highly commendable. They have remarkable strengths, talents, and skills at their disposal to develop positive and productive coping strategies, tap into existing support networks, or even create their own. Many LGBT students are another's role models and sources of support, learning from each other's experiences. Through these experiences, they can make a difference and contribute positively to their communities. Given the ongoing attempt to mainstreaming LGBT issues in South Africa, the educational resources are articulated, the message that teacher competence has expanded to include knowledge of and ability to teach about sexual and gender diversity. National Center of Lesbian Rights found that a student out of the closet should expect harassment simply because they are uncomfortable addressing the situation. The school is liable for not providing equal protection. In its 68-page report, Just Let Us Be, Discrimination Against LGBT Students in the Philippines, the New York-based HRW documented the range of abuses against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students in secondary school. But LGBT students, according to the HRW, claim that existing protection lack consistency and that discrimination secondary school policies and practice often facilitate discrimination and fail to provide LGBT students with information and support. In educational institutions, LGBT people are subject to discrimination, bullying, and abuse under the guise of academic freedom, allowing educational institutions to create their policies. Unfortunately, the curricula did not include LGBT issues. However, the Department of Education sought to protect all children from violence, abuse, and exploitation by issuing an order in 2012. The effort to promote gender equality resulted in the outspread participation of LGBT individuals in on-campus events and student councils. Finally, Jones emphasized following a safe and supportive schools approach through applying LGBT inclusive sexuality and anti-homophobia education, counseling, and awareness. For my methodology, the study sample consisted of 200 junior high school teachers, 14 guide focal persons, and 14 principals from respondents from 8 public schools and 6 private schools strategically located in Dumaguete City, Negros Oriental, Philippines. Teachers were selected when the researcher randomly chose using random sampling from each of the school. Guide vocal persons were all chosen from each school. Then principals were those from the 14 junior high school. In an individual interview, each respondent completed a survey questionnaire and was a part of a focus group discussion. Results and discussion for Table 1. In Paper 1, in promoting gender equality, guide vocal persons from private school with a weighted mean of 2.03 and public school with a weighted mean of 2.29 are less compliant, suggesting a low compliance level. The private school principals are not compliant with a weighted mean of 1.65. In contrast, moderately compliant public school principals with weighted mean 2.74, implying a higher compliance level. Then the private school teachers are less compliant with a weighted mean of 2.43, where the public school teachers are moderately compliant with a weighted mean of 2.79 in promoting gender equality. The principals in private schools tend to have a lower compliance level than the public schools since data show that the private school principals are less compliant with a weighted mean of 1.82. In contrast, the public schools are moderately compliant with a weighted mean of 3, and the private schools with a weighted mean of 2.79 and a public with a weighted mean of 3.08. School teachers are moderately compliant with the policy. For Table 2, the guide vocal person's involvement in the provisions of Deputy Order Number 2 is presented in Table 2. The private school respondents were rarely involved with a weighted mean of 2.18. In the implementation of the policy, the result reflects their lack of involvement shown in the following responses: never involved, rarely involved, and sometimes involved, but they are often involved in promoting children's protection against all forms of gender-based violence, abuse, discrimination, and bullying. On the other hand, the public school respondents were sometimes involved with a weighted mean of 2.98 in the policy implementation. They were never involved in providing library resources, books about sexual diversity in one classroom corner. The finding supports the previous results, which show that God-vocal persons in the public schools are more capable and more involved than their private school counterparts. However, both respondents cannot provide library resources, books about sexual diversity in the classroom. Perhaps they rely on the teachers to do this task rather than the God-vocal persons themselves. In Table 3, the principal's extensive involvement on the provisions of Deputy Order Number 32. In contrast, in public school, principals are often involved in with a weighted mean of 3.65, more appropriately than their private schools counterparts. Similarly, they cannot provide library resources, books about sexual diversity in one corner of the classroom, but focus on the protecting children against all forms of gender-based violence, abuse, discrimination, and bullying. The public school principals are often involved in far more activities than their private school counterparts. The finding further supports the fact that the type of school is a factor in the successful policy implementation. Thus, LGBT students in the private schools do not get the adequate protection they desire in the private schools even during the enforcement of Deputy Order Number 32 2017 implementation. Table 4 shows the teachers' extent of involvement in the provisions of Deputy Order Number 22. The private school teachers are sometimes involved with a weighted mean of 2.95, like their counterparts in the public schools' weighted mean of 3.06. They are rarely or sometimes involved in implementing the policy, but often involved in promoting inclusive education, child protection, addressing gender-based barriers, and promoting gender equality. This finding supports the view that without clear guidance on the importance of a policy protecting the LGBT group, it could not serve much. Mayer argued that the absence of clear protection and could lead to contradicting interpretation and application of the policy. Table 5 present the Sperman-Rowe correlations that indicate an association between the higher levels of involvement and compliance. And the individual compliance categories show this kind of relationship. The respondents with higher levels of involvement tend to promote gender equality, reflect non-discriminatory attitude in the curriculum, address gender dimension in planning and other forms of service delivery, and allocate tasks to subunits to preserve LGBT rights. Thus, it rejects the null hypothesis of no relationship. For my conclusion, school managers God focal persons, principals, and teachers who have higher levels of involvement to implement the policy tend to have a higher level of compliance. Those implementers who have low involvement in implementing the gender responsive education policy may be given first hand exposure to conduct LGBT needs and activities. In general, God focal persons are more likely to be gender responsive and principals the least. Thus, school administrators are less likely to be gender responsive than teachers and God focal persons. Thank you very much. Good day, everyone.